Even Mary.
Okay, looks like we'll begin our Development Commission meeting of Wednesday, May 3rd,
Right?
2017. And first order of business is for us to approve some minutes of April 19th, 2017. Excellent, excellent minutes. Really appreciate that work. That's hard work, but good.
5 hours worth, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So, has everybody read the minutes?
Yes.
Are there anybody interested in making a motion?
Move to approve.
Okay,
Second.
okay. Any discussion, corrections?
Great job, Susan.
Excellent. All those in favor of approving the minutes, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Looks like we approved the minutes.
Great. So we have, as you've noticed, 2 new members, 2 new alternates tonight, Richard Sanford and Ryan Roeder. Am I saying that right? We have one more member who isn't here tonight. Next meeting will be elections, so start jockeying for positions. We don't know when
Notice
that
there's
next
a
meeting's
subtle
going to be.
move away
No.
And the FBI has promised not to get involved.
No last-minute announcements. So we'll do that next meeting. We don't know when the next meeting is. It may be related to this. I can't remember if there are any other permits coming up. And Keith said he thought he saw them out there.
We use Mirage. So I think we're going to spend, since we have 2 new members here this evening, I thought, Lucy and I thought it would be good, especially since we might have a few minutes, to spend a little bit of time just on why we're talking about architectural guidelines and urban design, and primarily for you 2 guys who I'm sure just crawled out from underneath a rock. It's a joke, sorry. So the city's in a moratorium right now. It was enacted in September of last year. And there were a number of reasons why it was enacted, but here we are. And as the commission is well aware, it didn't mean that everything stopped, which is why we spent quite a bit of time last meeting talking about a development proposal. So there are a number of things that are still moving, but basically what it did was anything that hadn't already come in the door basically had to park and wait. And the reason why we're waiting are for the topics that you see on, and this is actually, the city has a moratorium webpage. You can get there via the city's webpage, and you go into development services, and then there's a bottom icon you can click on the moratorium. And then once you get here, we've had each of the staff project leads work to kind of create a subpage that will give you a little bit more information about what each topic is, including maybe the next public touches, what the schedule might be, because all of the work plan items are actually moving at different speeds and moving a little bit different courses depending on what the topic is. For architectural guidelines and urban design, we decided that it made the most sense to spend a majority of the time talking that through with the Development Commission, since those are the tools that you guys will ultimately use in the future. But whereas something like parking, we really decided that our best course of action was to hire a consultant, because parking is something that every jurisdiction deals with, good and bad. And rather than recreate the wheel, we felt like the best thing for us to do would be to get a technical report by a consultant that would tell us, 1, are we right parked? And 2, what would happen if we actually changed our rules to mandate a certain percentage of parking to be in structure? And so that's that project. It's actually, because it's much more of just a technical analysis and less kind of public outreach, it's the farthest along. It'll be finished first, and it actually informs some of the other things that are happening, so it makes sense. Whereas like district visions or neighborhood visions, that has conversely the most public outreach, so it's actually going to be the one that probably finishes up last. So these 6 items are in different stages of completion, and staff are really hoping that we can get most of them done by the time the council has to either renew or reconsider the moratorium, which would be in September of this year. So basically, the way that the state statutes work is if you don't know an exact timeline for what you need to fix, you basically go on a revolving 6-month kind of window. And so we've already renewed it once, and then we'll be due again in September of this year. So right now, we're all kind of focused on getting these things kind of put together so that by the time we hit September, hopefully the council feels comfortable that we've addressed the issues that they feel needed addressing, and would potentially lift the moratorium at that time.
Is there a limit on how many times you can roll over the 6 months?
Not explicitly. There's an intuitive level of pain that you need to be sensitive to. At some point, so a city can get sued if it has basically a perpetual moratorium in place. So you have to be able to demonstrate that you're making progress towards lifting it. And I think that at this point, we can genuinely say that we are doing what we need to do to accomplish that. Now, it could very well be that come September, the council says, you know what, let's do 2 months. They don't have to do 6 months, so they could say, well, you're pretty close, you're not quite there, so let's look at this thing in December, and maybe by then everything will be ready and we'll lift the moratorium at that point. So it's a little fluid on that front, but you can't basically keep, so part of the rules, if you will, is you have to have specific things that you're working on, right? You can't just say, we're going to enact a moratorium because we haven't seen the sun, for 6 months, because the sun came out today. Hi, gentlemen. So it has to be tangible, and there has to be a way to actually get to an end. And so I think we're well within our bounds in terms of protocols. But at some point, if we've adequately addressed these 6 items, I don't think the council could legitimately say they wouldn't lift the moratorium. I think it would put the city in an awkward spot. But I'm not a city attorney. All right, any other questions? Randy?
I think Newcastle was the first city that I know of to put a moratorium in place. Do you know of any other towns that have it, that are in the Seattle metropolitan area, and is theirs continuing, as far as you know, Keith? I know you're...
So there are moratoriums so Issaquah actually had a moratorium earlier, many moons ago, and it was for... we had both a water supply issue. This was before we joined Cascade Water Alliance, when we were dependent solely upon well water. And there's a capacity limitation that we were hitting. So we basically hit our capacity that way. When Issaquah Highlands got built, they actually built a transmission line from Bellevue out, which basically took any limitation we would have off from a water standpoint. But recently, related to things like we're dealing with now, Newcastle enacted a moratorium because they weren't getting any mixed use in what they call their town center area. I believe that Mercer Island enacted a moratorium recently. It was more about, I think, their residents having issues with the amount of growth that was happening in Mercer Island. There's a lot of parallels between Mercer Island and Issaquah in an odd way. Sammamish has been talking about it. They haven't done it yet. Will they do it? Maybe. Every time I drive up to the plateau, I'm surprised at the number of subdivisions that are in progress right now. Somebody east of us did. I can't remember if it's North Bend or Snoqualmie. One of the two of them dropped the moratorium kind of veil as well. So right now, I think it's just a general reaction to communities struggling with kind of the pace and the scale of growth that's going on right now. And I think that, putting some more tools in our toolbox, which is what this is really about for us, I think will get us to a better place once it gets lifted.
Thank you.
Hope that was helpful. And any questions, feel free. You can shoot me and Lucy emails later if you want. But I'm going to go ahead and stop since,
I'm just going to switch chairs because the baby chair over here, I'd like to see over the counter.
that's fine. So Don and Jason, welcome. I was your stand-up act here. I was keeping the crowd engaged until you guys got here. So you guys can just take over. Great. Your show at this point.
We have a routine up here.
Old hats at this point. Can't see the screen very well from over there.
Yeah, it says darn sun today, I think, is part of the problem, too.
I hope you guys had sun as well.
It did.
It's just like this the entire. Can I drop those shades?
No, but we can shut lights off. Okay. I would not know how to drop the shades. You're right. You just keep turning them down, Lucy.
Oh,
There, it's good. We can do that one, Jason. I don't have to do that one.
This guy's, I'm with this guy.
Awesome.
So what we're calling this is a preference workshop, so it's pretty open. So my sense is there's quite a few slides, and I don't necessarily want to wait till I finish this. So if you guys chime in and ask questions as I go along, and I'll pause too to make sure that we can do this. So
Can I, before we start,
Yeah.
just a quick question? So can you let us know kind of at the beginning here, kind of what you're looking for from us in comments, feedback, suggestions, as you're tracking through this?
yeah, I can do that. And so what we're looking for is a direction so that we can develop a draft document for the architecture fit and urban design. And so what we're trying to do right now is really try to frame some ideas for you that will be then translated into that document. But without this basic framework, it's difficult for us to just produce something because otherwise it's going to be our opinion, not necessarily yours or the community's. So that's really what this is intended to do. And it's based on the comments and other things that we've heard before, and then our reaction to that, and trying to give you an option as how to deal with your with the Central Issaquah plan and the standards that accompany it. So that's what I'm saying is I'm going to pause and ask questions as we go through here so that we just don't get too far along on the discussion. So presentation, further discussion, and then a little bit about the next steps. So here's the project schedule. Here we are, May 3rd. We were back in almost a month ago talking to you. Since that time, we also talked to City Council and gave them that same presentation. And so in the meantime, we've done roughly what we call a visual assessment. It's more than that. But we're here to present it tonight. And then you see the schedule after this, we'll present a draft. And it's going to be a bit iterative, and we'll be talking to you again later this month, maybe a rough, more or less a shell of what that document's going to look like. And then in June, unless these dates have changed, Keith, I don't know, but
I think we're going to talk about the
Yeah.
schedule soon.
but generally it's in here somewhere. We're going to be talking within a month or so, and also the land and shore. And so the idea is really to kind of finish this up in August. So just as a reminder, going back to the Central Issaquah plan and the design manuals, what the intent of this is to do. Okay. And these are the project tasks. We've already done the assessment. We're here to then come back and look at some, in the next phase, in the end of May, the guidelines, and then any changes would happen at the end of the process to your existing standards. And we talked about what we heard, general comments. I won't go through this because we got more things to talk about, but this is just a reminder. What we heard about buildings, we had a discussion about that, the architectural concerns, about what you were getting. and then site development, in other words, the urban design framework, what was occurring as well. So with that initial assessment, we identified a couple of things with your existing central Issaquah district visions, that they're word heavy, and there really isn't any drawings or plans that accompany these, so they're easily interpreted by one person or another in different ways. Their land use framework really isn't informed by those visions much. It's very generic. And the roadway system, the circulation system, the ped and bike, and the lacking of a transit system, which something that is not the fault of the plan, simply because ST3 didn't occur until after this project was, a plan was adopted. So it needs some hierarchy and a little bit more definition. In particular, understanding how land uses relate to it. And likewise with the civic, the green necklace piece, there really isn't any focal points or areas that you would build housing around, for example, things like public parks really aren't all that well defined. What we did also do is then review some and looked at the projects that you have either approved or reviewed recently, and those are indicated here in that magenta purplish color. And so we looked at the Inniswood project and have a sense of what you reviewed, and looked at the staff reports and have a sense of what was discussed with that and your views of these projects. We looked at the Atlas project. The site plan in particular is something I think was of interest to us, and the relationship of essentially it's a apartment complex adjacent to a greenway and a park, and the orientation of buildings and other things like that were something we talked about. Materiality and massing and things like that, and then colors is probably the hot point there. Gateway, again, the question here was, we heard again and again, was about the lack of mixed use and the character of the development seemed somewhat isolated as well, and also Riva townhomes. So we looked at all this. So I'm not going to go through a lot on that, but we have taken a look at it along with the Vale project and looked at some of the recommendations that you all have made as well. So that was just background, just to get us back up to date. So for tonight, the preference discussion is going to talk about what's highlighted: livability, sustainability, and balanced mixed-use urban area, and with an emphasis on urban area, and changing the area from a series of strip malls and office buildings to something that's different and is in a natural setting that's represents the values of the community. So what we've tried to do is really focus this discussion around the guiding principles of the Central Issaquah Plan when we start looking at some issues. So we want to go through each one of these one at a time and see if we're doing the right thing. So the first guiding principle is about integrating the environmental features such as creeks and views. And so that's pretty clearly articulated in words in a couple of diagrams in the plan. And so our take on this is that we've got a couple things going on with the district. You've got a destination on each end, which is like Sammamish and the Old Town. And there appears to be, and there clearly is, a poor linkage between those two destinations and Central Issaquah today. And the issue is on this is that if you want to have that linkage, the northern side of the area north of I-90 is fairly contiguous and strong today with a lot of green spaces. So you can navigate along that if you had a pathway, a walkway, a bikeway along it, connecting the two, until you get to I-90, which creates that barrier along Issaquah Creek. And then south of that is really fractured, and the open space is not continuous. And so if that's going to be a key connection, there needs to be an intervention in some ways to tie that back together. And it seems like it's such a strong idea to do this. to focus your development along and towards the creek and your greenway, the Lake Sammamish Trail, and then make sure that development floats into that development and find a framework that supports that. So it isn't piecemeal, but there are some strategic actions over time that lead you to take advantage of that resource, which is unique to any other area around here, and it really is the defining feature of central Issaquah. So then this piece in itself is probably the most important thing to try to get right in our point of view as you move forward. So any discussion about that piece right now, or discussion that we should know, is this the right approach? Are we missing this at all?
One of my fellow commissioners and I are pretty active in the Friends of Issaquah Salmon Hatchery, and I guess one of the things that Fish watches, we're not political, but one of the things that we watch real closely is for impact on the creek and the salmon run. And this sounds great so far, but I think we need to be really aware of the fact that, and there are tremendous standards in place and regulations and everything. I understand that will guard the creek, but in the interest of emphasizing the uniqueness of the creek and its importance to the city, I think that has to be balanced with buffers, a real clear understanding from the get-go of what is going to be defined in terms of what you can do to focus on that and enhance the creek environment at the same time.
So our sense is that's what we'd like to see, buffers, to be able to clearly define that. And then through some design standards, make sure that this isn't a backdoor area, but it has a front door orientation or a side door orientation, so it isn't out back and behind a backwater, but it has more prominence. Not necessarily we need to interact with the creek, but we need to have some awareness that it's there, that it isn't there today.
Thank you.
All right, so let's go on to the next one, which is, there's really three things I want to talk about here with transportation: vehicle, transit, and pedestrian mobility. And so the first thing that we asked staff for is to get a better sense of the amount of traffic in here, because we know there's a lot. But one of the guiding principles in the Central Issaquah plan is to make a pedestrian-friendly, walkable district. And when we work in communities around the country, we know there's a certain datum line where it becomes not pedestrian-friendly anymore, and people will stay away from it, or you need to separate people significantly with a significant buffer away from traffic. And typically that number is about 15,000 trips a day. So when you're looking at Sammamish Road at 42,000 trips, you got Newport with 14 on the edge, Gilman with 28, Lake Sammamish Parkway with 49, we're way above that number. And so it has an impact on creating a cohesiveness for the entire district. And so what we do know is that those collector and arterial roads are important as regional resources. And so we also know that with over 100,000 trips a day in I-90, it creates a north-south barrier. And even more importantly, the existing crossings today are so hostile that very few people are willing to cross those. With on and off ramps, you know, the basic thing is, would you take an 8-year-old across the street? Or if you were 80, are you going to cross that roadway? And I'd challenge anybody to do that. So you're really left with only one underpass or two that you can actually cross from the south to north in this very large area. The other thing that is apparent to us is that Gilman is being used as a regional facility, and we question whether that is appropriate for this district to further promote that and allow a lot of regional cut-through traffic on Gilman. It's in the heart of your district, and as a result of all of these roadways, the development is very bifurcated. with 40 and 50,000 trips a day, it's very difficult to say that I got a pedestrian-friendly environment when I've got to cross these roadways or walk along them. So something needs to be done with that. So as a result of this, the district has more of this sort of characteristics. It's a place to drive through rather than a destination. And I think a clear objective here is what can we do to accommodate the very necessary regional traffic, the city traffic, but make this more of a destination. So one of the things that we'd like to do is have a little bit more definition about the green necklace and really truly create something that is more of a necklace in terms of mobility network. So think about the arterial roads as mobility complete streets, where you can accommodate these high volumes of traffic, but if somebody's going to walk along it, they're separated and protected on multi-use paths. And you do this pretty good job in certain portions of your roadways today. For example, Newport, on certain parts of it, is pretty good roadway. And so it's not that you don't have good models here locally how to do that. The issue is it just needs to be a continuous necklace, not necessarily a pieces of fits and starts. So we need to really is to try to push the regional traffic along the edges rather than trying to concentrate it up the middle. And so here's the big leap here. And this is a point of discussion that we'd like to have it talk to you about, and is rethinking Gilman and thinking it as a common thread tying the districts and the focus of all development in the district. So when you look at this pink area in the middle, Gilman's pretty much in the middle. And so if you try to say, is there a signature street that would be identifiable, viable for the district, we ask, is Gilman that street? And what would be the character of that street? Because in the previous meetings, for example, in city council, some of the councilors said, why have we given up on Gilman? I almost assumed that we would have buildings engaging the street, and that's where we would get the mixed use with the street-oriented retail on it, not off 7th on an Atlas project where the developer's saying it's not viable. We know that retail needs a certain amount of drive-by traffic. You need to have at least 5,000 trips a day. And as I mentioned before, to get over 15,000, it becomes pedestrian hostile. So the question is, can we redesign Gilman so that it has more of the characteristics of front going through Old Town? So it's 2 lanes of traffic, on-street parking, and maybe it's not convenient for people cutting through your community, but then it becomes that focus of development. So that's an issue and something that we'd like to have a discussion. Is any comment about that, a thought about it?
How do you see, excuse me, how do you see Gilman Village in this?
I'm not quite sure yet, because we haven't looked at every bit of anything in the entire site. And for example, why, can you inform me why you're asking that question?
Well,
specific?
I guess there are 2 things. One is that I moved here in 1989, and my understanding is that it was considered a tourist attraction, and buses would come in from all over the Seattle area to bring people in to shop at Gilman Village. Yeah. And it's still very viable. Yeah. But there, it just seems to be isolated where it is, and people that like it and know about it love it. Yeah. But it seems to me like it's kind of at least a potential anchor, if not already, for what you're talking about.
It could very well be that. So we haven't really specifically looked at that area. And I'll talk to, as we move through this, we'll talk about some of the areas that we have looked at specifically.
I'll throw in I guess my opinion, I like your idea a lot, because I don't think there's think of it, I guess it's probably classified as a parkway, the category, which I'm assuming we would downgrade this to a different kind of street, but it's not like you've got a long distance to go that you need to go 35 or 40 miles an hour to get somewhere quickly. And you're right, I think to make that a more activated street for the pedestrian, one of the challenges could be something you could do to where it abuts up to I-90 to sort of separate that a little more to make it that more pedestrian friendly on that side too. But in general, I like the idea a lot of
Yeah.
making that a more personable
Yeah.
street.
So this would take clearly some more traffic analysis to really make it real, but the idea here is, I think that you've got enough capacity on a lot of your other big streets. And frankly, I don't think you're under any obligation to provide more capacity for people who are moving through your community. And so so that's the idea. And you see those two circles? One of the things that we've talked about in the Central Issaquah plan is about gateways. And really, the question is, where is really the real gateway for your community? And if we're going to say that that is your signature street, and the most people, 119,000 people, are coming off of the freeway, that's the gateway. And those 2 points off of Highway 18 and going south of Sammamish Parkway. So I would argue, if you're looking for a signature point for a gateway, those are the two areas you really should concentrate on it. And there may be some sort of transitions coming off of Newport or off of some of the other streets, but any thought about that? Because I think it is important to get gateways, but they've got to be meaningful. And we can suggest some ways of how to create a significant gateway, if that's something we should be pushing for in additional time.
Couple comments
Yeah.
maybe on the idea. I like the idea of Gilman Boulevard being the signature street. I don't know where else you would put it. I think people associate Front Street and Old Town section with the image of Issaquah, at least
Yeah.
currently. We're talking about the future, the distant
Yeah.
future on some of this thinking right now. So it's kind of what do we want it to be? I think that there are a couple of challenges with Gilman. One is it is handling a lot of traffic, and it has to go somewhere. And when it goes somewhere, it creates more congestion wherever it goes. And so that's an impact to the community that obviously has to be analyzed and try to figure out where the gives and takes. The other is, and we ran into it on the Atlas project, that there are some environmental challenges with bringing buildings up to Gilman Boulevard on the south side, because there's a big drainage that runs through there. And so that's going to offer some challenges to try to figure out how to deal with that to allow for buildings to essentially come up to face the street, to create that kind of more interesting pedestrian environment. As far as the gateway, I like the ideas of gateways. It's kind of it frames the image, the experience that people are about ready to have, or that they've had on the way out, because gateways work kind of both ways. The challenge at Highway 900 is that's a huge intersection up there. That's handling a lot of traffic, a lot of regional traffic that's going through there. So it would require a lot of thinking and probably significant investment to actually make a statement at that location. A little easier to do it down at the Front Street intersection, or where you leave Front Street and move on to Gilman Boulevard. I think there are some good opportunities there to make an interesting gateway statement.
All right, because we don't know what that would be, but it's something we can think about.
Back to the map there, the one at Front Street. So last week at the Planning Policy Commission meeting, they were discussing the Old Town sub-area plan, and there was discussion about where the gateway to that should be, because they were talking about actually lopping off. There was a proposal to reduce the Old Town area further south, move the entrance further south, essentially to where the creek was. I think the commission recommended not doing that and keeping the north barrier up towards where Staples was, up towards Gilman. And there was discussion about where the gateway to Old Town was. But it would be interesting then to think, could there be like a double gateway, the Old Town and the Gilman, two gateways starting at the same location?
I have one more comment about the gateways, if I can jump in there real quick. So I would argue that there's this third gateway, though. I like what this does to connect the south side, but what about as you're heading to East Lake Sammamish there, if you're going to or from, and at Pickering, it feels like development's moving that way, and it has a very different quality over there. So how do we bring that quality to that side? Yeah, exactly. How do we bring that quality, the qualities that will define, being more characteristic with Front Street, et cetera. But how do we draw you up that way and also let you know you're leaving or you've come into Issaquah?
Yeah. So I think it's a good comment, and I think we can take a look a little bit more on that as well.
Okay.
Okay. So,
I just,
yeah, go ahead.
one more thing on Gilman. This is absolutely not data supported, but I think that there was a pretty clearly some citizen concern about Front Street when it was being redone for the water main. A lot of folks didn't understand that there was a infrastructure maintenance issue that resulted in a lot of the trees being taken down, and now the plan is to put them back. But Gilman, the trees that have been there, the fruit trees and the nut trees and so on that have been planted there that are public, that people can go harvest.
Yeah.
I think this is a great plan from what we've seen so far, but I would suggest that preservation of those is going to be important,
Sure.
regardless of how this goes. And if they have to be taken down, there's going to have to be a pretty clear statement about
Yeah.
how that's going to be accommodated.
And I think the issue is when we think about this, there's no concept drawn up for this, but I don't think it's a one-size-fits-all for the entire roadway. I think for many segments of it, it may be as it is today, but as you hit what we are going to call, I'll show you a little bit later, hubs, it may change more significantly. So then we've got to look at the off-street multi-use trail systems on the outer loops. And then on these inner loops, so especially on Gilman, think of it in terms of complete street facilities that is similar to this. So this is a design we did for 152nd Street in Redmond that goes to Microsoft and to the light rail station. It was 4 lanes, suburban roadway, very much like Gilman. Knocked it down to 3, and the development is actually being built on the right side. It's a project called Estera right now is being built, and the city is building the piece on the left side fairly soon as well. So these things do happen on these roadways. So this may not be at all what you want it to look like, but it just give you a sense of it can happen where you've got pedestrian, bicycle, and auto traffic all mixed in the same. And also there's a rapid bus system on this as well. So moving on then to talk about transit. And so the thing on this is to keep in mind is that there is a, ST3, and it really at this point is a dashed line on the map. And the question is, how do you get ahead of this? Because this is, it's a corridor, and there's bubbles identified for possible station locations. And so what we've done is, we do a lot of transit work. In fact, we're just starting a new project in the Twin Cities, looking at 10 stations and an entire corridor, and designing and doing the development around that. And so we get a sense of what the transit agencies want to do. And you see that little red box up there. The key is to do this, maximize ridership. So you really need to hit the destinations that you have today, like a park and ride. And you really want to take advantage of like Costco, because that's a lot of employment. So that gets a lot of people off the roadway. You want to minimize costs. You want to find the cheapest route as possible, and you want to minimize impacts. So you want to avoid taking out buildings, taking out and crossing sensitive areas, or making traffic conditions worse at major intersections. So here's a real quick shot at this. And this is a subject, obviously, to change. But having done enough of this work, we think that you've got an option here that you can take advantage of all those things. So what we're suggesting is that the alignment is probably going to come along I-90, looking at the diagrams. And the diagrams always show just a line coming into Issaquah and probably going to the park and ride. And we're suggesting maybe to avoid any conflicts or disturbance along this intersection, you run it on the backside of Hyla, outside of the wetlands, of course. You need about 35, 37 feet for a trackway. And cross up and over, you've got a substation there. Fly over the top and get to your multimodal station and tie the buses, the park and ride all into one station. Come all the way back down over to 12th and go over to Tibbetts and have another station, cross over to the freeway, and have a terminus station at Costco. So The assumption is sometimes is that I only get one station, but you have the privilege of being at the end of the line. And when we looked at downtown Redmond, we did the same thing. We did a thing that we called the boomerang. We went past downtown Redmond, went to a park and ride, and came directly back into the downtown. And that's under design right now. And we did that work in 2005, way before ST3. So this may be just one of the options that you need to look at, but I think the point of this is it's best to get ahead of the ball game and be proactive rather than reactive when you start talking about light rail. And this would have a lot of benefits for you. So those are the 3 stations that I just mentioned. And around the Pickering station, you can then develop what's called Transit-Oriented Development District and really try to create some value with that area. A question, yes?
Sir, I absolutely could be wrong on this, but it seems to me that in the first meeting that we had with you folks, I thought you were pretty strongly in favor of putting this terminus of this in the Highlands. I thought a couple of you folks said that that would be the only logical place to do it.
Well, we're just saying it's just following the map that they've given us today, which doesn't go to the Highlands.
Okay.
So if you want to go to the Highlands, that's another option. And so I think going to the Highlands is also a very strong idea as well. So I'm just saying this is one option that needs to be looked at. And so the value of this, jealously for the Central Issaquah, you can create a TOD. And that is really, when you see this fried egg pattern, it really achieves most of the objectives that you have today, was having increased density in a more urban setting. And it really becomes an impetus for a lot of development. And there's some benefits of this by doing the TOD. You see that list of things. You get increased ridership, you get fewer and shorter auto trips. And the one that is really hidden is you get increased property values. When you get a light rail station, typically you get at least a 10% increase in value when you get a station in your neighborhood. And so when we're looking at tipping points to do things like structured parking or other things that you would like to see in your development area that the developers are not really reticent to do it today because they can't make the numbers work. So if you can increase the value of the property, you start getting a different urban form as well. And there's just these other 2. You get health benefits and economic development, and it makes it unique and different than everything else, placemaking. So what we've tried to do is then take a look at how you'd interpret that diagram onto this plan itself. So you see that quarter mile, that's a 5-minute walk. So that's most of the Tibbetts area and part of Gilman as well. And then we do something else we call mobility-oriented district, where we try to connect to stations with a bike system to increase access to transit. And a bike ride a mile away is also 5 minutes. So the timing is important because people start choosing different modes if their trip length is too long. So, and then you get that hub that I just pointed out as well. So that's something to think about, because I think that's something that wasn't anticipated in the Central Issaquah plan, and it would be something that needs to be updated as part of the plan in the future. And this is one option, but you may have a couple of those as well, different as well.
Can I make a couple comments
Yeah.
on that real quick? So I agree, when the Central Issaquah plan was developed, ST3 wasn't on the radar yet, and now that it's been passed and Issaquah is designated as a destination for
Yeah.
light rail. So that, in station area planning and what you were just talking about at a high level is, within the walk shed and et cetera, and doing different types of development, transit-oriented development, gives you new range of opportunities. And so the question is about timing, because you could say, well, we could think about it now, but probably have to do it later. You really need to think about, how do we anticipate what that will do to development in the city, and then as we're working through the update that's happening now, build in the tools that will help us more effectively prepare for light rail when it really starts to become the conversation with Sound Transit about where these stations are going to be, what kinds of costs are associated with this, you know, what are the city's preferences, et cetera, because if you're not thinking ahead and preparing the city, it actually gives you more leverage if you're saying, we've got a plan for how we want the city to grow,
Absolutely.
and we've considered the light rail factor here, and this is what we want to do. And so it brings you into a better, I think, negotiating place. But it's hard to do it now because it's so preliminary. But it is, you know, thinking ahead, like you said, how do we put in place the tools and/or the areas of the city where we can anticipate making those quick adjustments to increase density through TOD, maybe reduce parking as a result of easy access now to transit. There probably will be a need for additional parking structures because you're beginning attracting all this traffic from the east that will come to the light rail stations and then want to get on and ride. So you've got a lot of pieces to really think about that are big pieces that you've got to build into the plan.
And you said it better than me. So, and I think that's really the point of this, is to get ahead of it and be able to use it to inform the development of this district. And figure out what are the other infrastructure needs that you need as well. And so that's
Sir,
one thing.
I'd like to
Yeah.
follow up on Mike's question. Can you give us some of your experience on what the differences, if any, might be between a transit station that is a terminus and a transit station that's in the middle of the line in terms of parking requirements?
Well, you're
Because
going to get.
Because Commissioner Brennan's point, I think, is extremely salient, that the anticipation here is that we're probably going to need more parking for a given station than somebody that's in the middle of the run and is drawing from the neighborhood. Because we're going to get North Bend, we're going to get Covington, we're going to get a lot of these places that are going to come in.
It depends. It depends on what origin and destination people have. Because it relates to travel time and trip lengths. So because what we looked at, where do people tend to change modes? So they're going to drive in as close as they can to reduce their travel time. So it's not necessarily the best place always to put the park and ride at the end of the station, because if people can drive through and get on closer to their final destination, that might be the place where you have a need for a park and ride rather than at the very end. So it's a bigger discussion about what the origin and destinations are regionally, but fundamentally you do need a significant park and ride at the end because you have people coming from outer areas. So you're right about that, but it may not be the most significant park and ride in the region. But the reality is there's a big site already here for a park and ride lot, and it simply could get bigger. So there's no doubt about that. You can accommodate a heck of a lot more cars on the Sound Transit site today. And it's located where you want it. It's on a state highway off a freeway intersection, and it's not in the middle of your community. So strategically, it's in the right place for you. And, you know, looking at all the people going down to Maple Valley and everywhere else south of here, you know, it's not a bad place to put it. So,
Although I would propose that perhaps we would want to focus Metro on putting park and ride lots, say at Highway 18 and I-90 and maybe in Preston, develop places there. Those people can park there, take a shuttle to the transit station here so that all of that traffic doesn't come into Issaquah.
so you might get some of that, but again, every time I have to change mode, it's a discouragement of traffic. So if I
Sure.
got to go wait for a shuttle bus,
Yeah,
15 more
but-
minutes,
but
then
I
I got
don't
to
wanna-
train to the train.
But I don't want to feel like
Yeah.
that I'm doing this to make it convenient for North Bend commuters
Yeah.
to come in,
So the other thing to think about this long-term is what we'd call a reverse commute, where if you create a center here, a true a center, you'll find people actually coming from the west and coming the other direction. So if Costco grows, for example, has more employment, so you're going to have people having an opposite commute. If this really becomes a really successful district that's envisioned as having a lot of jobs in this area as well. So there's some other benefits as well. So we could have a long discussion about transit, and you know, that we can go on that, but I want to keep rolling here a bit. So the next guiding principle was about housing and trying to get, take advantage of development, and I'm thinking I'm getting this right, is to get more development into existing commercial sites and anticipating those turnover time, and those are prime areas for redevelopment in the central Issaquah plan. And so what we did is we had a discussion with Keith and Lucy about this, and also just our observations to say, where's the likelihood of getting any commercial development? And there are areas that are, what we've identified are areas that are stable. So those are areas that are in red generally. And the map might be off a little bit. But generally, we think that, you're not going to see, because of development agreement and the solidity of Costco, that's not going to go. And some of the areas on the edge, like the Sammamish corporate properties, that's probably going to be there for a while. So what we were looking for is areas that will turn over in the next 10, 15 years maximum. And so we've outlined those in blue and look for those shopping center. So you can, obviously, you know this, but it's just for our knowledge as well, as to say, where are the areas that you could get new development in? And it's considerable. There's a lot of areas, whether it's infill in Gilman, or it's incremental as part of the Raleigh development agreement, or maybe large, full-scale redevelopment of like the Fred Meyer and the Home Depot areas over time. There's opportunity to really change the form of this area to get it away from strip centers to an urban format. So the thing that struck us, especially when we start looking at the development patterns that you're getting right now, not to hit Atlas over the head again, but what is lacking there is a grid. And what is, as a result of that grid, you're getting an apartment complex, and you're getting monotony about it. And what the grid does, it creates smaller development parcels and really disciplines the developer to create more variety, rather than the saying, I have a large site and I can repeat the same thing over and over again. So that's one of the values of that. And so the second value of it is, from a traffic standpoint, the most important part of this, you're not loading all your traffic onto your arterial and collector streets, but you can diffuse it and spread it out on multiple points throughout your community. So you don't have to widen every roadway every time you get a development. You can spread it out. And we can create a more compact development pattern on the side. We can create more complete streets. And really then it gives you an ability to have more 18-hour activity on these smaller scale streets rather than these big arterial roadways. So the next step that we looked at is to say, all right, so if we want to do a grid, is there a local model that we'd want to follow? And where are there opportunities where we can do that grid? So the first thing we said there, yeah, you do. You've got some of the areas in the southern part of Gilman and into your old town that you do have a grid today. So it's not importing something from someplace else. You do have a grid. And so we started looking at the grid in Old Town and said, is there something we can learn from this that we should be, maybe if we were to institute a grid in central Issaquah, that maybe we should be replicating? And so we looked at the dimensions and said, all right, are these the kind of dimensions that you'd want to see for medium or higher density development? And the reality is some of your blocks are probably too long for that kind of development, because you're going to get these complexes again. They're just too big. So typically we'd like to see something like 240 by 240, and there's some blocks that you see here that would do that. So we think generally we'd like to see no block longer than 400 feet and a minimum width about 240 feet, because that is really efficient for parking and gives you the ability to develop any building type that you can think of. So with that, we looked at those purple areas and said, those areas are super blocks with large-scale commercial parcels. Can we, as a planning exercise, divvy these up into a grid? So the first thing we looked at is, if you've got a series of parcels that has a series of 3-acre areas that you see here, and what are the current requirements for the Central Issaquah plan? Currently, there is no requirement for a grid at all. There is some access requirements, and it's mostly in regard to providing pedestrian access at a maximum with distances between pedestrian access through a parcel at 250 feet. And as you see the diagram that I have here, there's no requirement that any of those greenways line up or connect to each other as well. So they're discontinuous, they're incremental, and often they go nowhere. And so the idea is, can we change this to give you something that is more rational, and more urban? So what we then did is to look at that typical development pattern and say, what happens if you were to grid it up and you create blocks that were typically about 240 by 240, and then you created a circulation pattern in between that. So you got a grid. And so what we also suggested is that even that 240 block is too big, and you probably still want to institute a pedestrian or an access way. So this could be what would be called a Mew or Woonerf, or some sort of street that you could get to parking, but you could also walk through. It could change anywhere that you see the green. And so we looked at the percentage of street to development area, and it's about 60-40. That's pretty urban. Suburban developers, that's high for them. So typically, when you get this sort of relationship, they're going to look for some sort of incentive or some sort of way of the city doing a public-private partnership to build some of the infrastructure. And lots of cities who want to do grids do that. They actually build the streets, and then the developers are responsible for the private development. So that's kind of the grid concept. So using that concept, we then overlaid that idea into those blue areas that I identified here, and this is the grid that we have. So instead of all these super blocks, the idea here is to lay out a grid and be somewhat prescriptive about this grid. Again, no block longer than 400 feet, no block narrower than 240 feet. So that you can then not necessarily say this is exactly what it's got to be, but at least you got a vision and a plan to say, this is generally what we're looking for. And not every of these streets has to be paved. It could be a green street. It could be just simply just a greenway through the middle. But you do want to have this sort of slicing and dicing this up so it's more consistent with your old town. So we're getting a little jumping around with our slides here for the didn't transfer well to the computer. So then we looked at the next guiding principle was economic vitality. And what we focused in on this one was about mixed-use projects. And this idea about where is the right place to get the right mix of uses, whether it's horizontally or vertically, and then overlay that on top of that grid. So we started off with the thing that we think is the hardest part to get right and is probably the most important in developing a vital district, and that is retail. Because retail needs to be on busy streets, fairly busy streets, 5,000 trips, not more than 15,000 for neighborhood-oriented retail. And it really should be the focus for each district. So we're calling these neighborhoods serving retail hubs. And so the suggestion is on the ground floor of these blocks adjacent to, for example, in Gilman or a major street, that, for example, up here, this is, I can't remember the street, you've already started developing a kind of a street-oriented retail approach up here, that these are where you would have requirements for retail. You would require that there is ground floor retail on those frontages. And they would be, as I mentioned before, have a different character. So one could be transit-oriented. There might be a specialty hub over here in the 10th Street, and maybe this combines with maybe some of the stuff over off of Gilman Village, so that has a different character. So that doesn't have to be all the same type of retail, but it should be street-oriented and pedestrian-oriented in those areas. And with this in mind, you would have enough assurances to require a developer, if they're going to do mixed-use retail a building, that they do it here. And you'd have confidence that it would be viable. Any questions about that piece at all? Because this is a pretty big deal. If we're going to talk about this signature street, we do need to have hubs with curbside parking, with retail, wide sidewalks, places for outdoor dining, outdoor cafes within these areas. Within these sections of the roadway, you might leave the roadway as it is today. So maybe it's green corridor, you leave it alone, but once you hit these little downtowns, if you will, these little neighborhood centers, it becomes slower, two-lane traffic, curbside parking. It's more like going down on Front Street. And it's just a smaller version of that.
Question for
Yeah.
you, I get the impression that the city council would look at this and think, that's not many retail hubs, not many places where we're requiring retail. And I guess if somebody asked that question, what would be your
I would
answer
say
to it?
this would be required, but you would not limit it to other areas.
Right.
These are the areas that you would say it's important to get it, and you have to do it. But if you want to build more of it, go for it.
Right, but this would be
Yeah.
sufficient for a required area, you think?
To create these centers and to achieve the objectives for each of these districts that you've laid out. Because all of these have these ideas about having an 18-hour environment, activity, and the retail will give you that. And then the other piece of this is to say with these hubs, you want to encourage housing or office above, but it's not necessary to require it. So you want the retail. The retail here is most important, not necessarily getting a mixed-use building.
Hubs are not a foreign concept either. I mean, if you look at the neighborhoods in Seattle, Wallingford, Fremont, they all have these characteristics where you have an aggregate of.
I can't hear you.
walkable-
I can't hear you.
Oh, sorry.
You have to come up here, Jason.
You have an aggregate of the commercial uses in these specific areas. And so this model really replicates something that is tried and true, and we see it throughout the region. We see it through Portland as well, so.
Yeah. And the reality is, if you follow the news, retail is changing a lot. You know, you're getting the online, the big boxes, that's going to change a lot. And the stuff that is strong still is the street-oriented neighborhood stuff. This, again, is getting ahead of the curve, like the light rail. If you start planning for the changing of the retail environment, you can deal with some of these, what are often called ghost box sites, very early. The next part of this, then, to think about this mixed use is, where are you going to put your office and employment uses, the commercial uses? And what we tend to find is that they want to be on what we call an addressing street. They want to be on 100 Broadway. You always hear these kind of addresses. And so you're even seeing it today with your development. So for example, the Sammamish Parkway is on an arterial roadway. So the places where, or even here in Hyla, you've got employment uses on the bigger roadways. That's a good model to keep going to. So to really start saying, let's concentrate on your employment uses on the corridors. And also, in addition to that, if you've got people who are coming into your community for employment, they're not getting into this middle core. They're staying on the big roads and then going into parking structures instead of driving through your districts. So you're keeping them on the big roads instead of inducing them to go in through your neighborhoods. Yeah.
I have a question about,
Yeah.
so as a requirement, could you give us an example of what the wording would be of requirement, so that when a prospective applicant or developer looks at it, what is the wording generally going to say?
I think that needs to be worked out, but typically I would say within 1 block of the arterial roadway for Hyla, for example, from I-90 to Newport. It needs to, retail required within 1 block of Highway 18.
So there's no description of type of retail or floor
Oh, you
space,
can-
minimum floor space?
No, I think you can overdo it. So I think the intent of this is really to to really try to streamline it and give you the ability to address it in any number of ways. But your objective is still, for example, if you're doing retail, you want to have that storefronts up to the street. And now you want to regulate the character of that storefront on the street as well. And we can get into that later about how you do that. But this is just a basic framework to start saying, if I want mixed uses, where do they go? Because it's been sort of a moving target. And there's been this sort of ongoing discussion that you could put anything anywhere as long as I can get the performer to work. And what we're trying to do is just really just say, you don't need to worry about that. You need to go to where you're going to be successful through a mapping and an urban design framework process rather than getting into that detail on a project-by-project basis.
Would it limit an applicant's ability to put retail if they want to do it that's adjacent to that or a block away from it or whatever?
No. So the idea is not to say that somebody can't do something, but if you're going to say you want to have office, this is where you want to require it. Because we know it'd be successful there. Because the next piece of this is to talk about housing and talk about where do you want to have housing. And so what you really want to do is you want to get housing in these areas. You want to have it in proximity to parks. Because in an urban situation, people don't have backyards. Your densities, when you're talking to your typical development now, is around 40 units an acre. People are looking for more than just a court in their development. They need a park. And kind of the rule of thumb is for urban density, you don't want to be more than 3 blocks away from an urban amenity, whether it's a trail, a tot lot park, a mini park. You need to have a green within 3 blocks of you. So that really becomes the focus for each neighborhood. You got retail and you got a park. And then you get the housing close to that. And then you want to get close to transit. So that's the other piece of this. So as you can see, you've got these little housing satellites going around a park, around a park, around a park, around a park, around the transit. So you're getting that fried egg from the TOD that we showed you, where you've got this intensity in the housing that surrounds it. So that's kind of the idea here with this, is to really start trying to define these neighborhoods a little bit better in that framework. So that's kind of, if we were to say we're looking for a mixed use, not worry about it so much vertically, but horizontally, and get the uses where they make the most sense. So you can come back in code and talk about this to say, so for example, as you get a redevelopment here, I need a park that is at least 2 acres in size, and all residential development must be within 3 blocks of it. And so you don't necessarily have to have as prescriptive of a map as this if that's not what you want, but you can translate this, include this in just a guiding document to say, here's our general thoughts, distribute this to developers, and then give them the opportunity to either match this or give you something better as part of it. So let's move on to, whoa, we got really jammed up on here, is a sense of community. And so what I wanted to then now jump is into some of the architecture stuff. So that was really kind of a lot of the urban design piece. And then when we were here last time, we talked about really developing the architectural guidelines based on 5 things: form, massing, scale, materials, and colors. And so we set this up as generally how we do a checklist. So if we came to the counter to talk to the planner, this is what you'd hand out to them. The developer and the planner would have a discussion about what applies as part of the guidelines. And then the developer and their architect would then have the responsibility to responding to that for yes or no as comply. So this is generally the way we'd set this up as a pre-proposal use of the tool. So you'd go through each one of the guidelines to give you just a little preview of what we're going to give you as part of the document. So what we then did is spend a lot of time thinking about this, because our sense is that you're getting some development that isn't sympathetic to your historic character in Gilman, in the Old Town. And then some areas, you're getting very generic development that could be placeless. But it's not necessarily bad development, but it needs to be driven in another direction a little, and it needs to be really reined in a little bit. So we started out with going to really 3 areas. So we're breaking this up into what we're calling an urban core style that really composes where your urban core is, plus a little bit of your Eastlake area, an Issaquah style, and then an industrial style. So there's really 3 different types of guidelines that we want to talk about and really really form the document around. And so the Issaquah style would be most of Gilman, except is it Town and Country? No, it's not Town and Country. The Commons Shopping Center. And then also parts of Darst Park along your little main street that is evolving here. And also the Fred Meyer and Home Depot. And then there's some redevelopment opportunities for Value Villages, and there's the building materials sites up in that area as well. So the thought would be this corridor along Lake Sammamish Parkway is really the organizer for that. And because of its proximity and relationships to a lot of the existing neighborhoods, we're saying that is respectful of one type of design approach. And so what we're suggesting on that is to be very prescriptive and really talk about eclectic historicism or historic types of buildings that have been built in these similar situations, whether it's in Issaquah itself or similar small-scale environments that you have here today. So we've broken it up and suggested that eclectic historicism would be 4 types of architecture. Craftsman, which is very similar to the stuff that you're already getting in your gateway development. Arts and crafts, which was developed at the same period of time. Northwest Lodge, which is a bigger iteration because some of the craftsman stuff works better for small buildings. And then Western Falls Front, which is the types of commercial buildings that you already have on Front Street. And say those are the only types of building that you can build within that area. So we looked at the models, and we heard that people sometimes hold this up, the Kalkari development, as one development, not necessarily as far as site planning, but materials and character that should be promoted more. And the craftsman style really has these characteristics. It's more house-like in massing, so it's compact. So you don't get buildings that are 200 feet long and are developed in large courtyards. They're usually small bars, if you will. They're typically no more than 4 stories and usually 3 or less. And then they're usually single-use buildings. So you don't typically ever find a ground floor retail component in a craftsman style building. So that's why they make sense for lower density or middle density residential areas in that district. So what does that have? It has these components. So you've got the tripartite division that your standards already talk about, pitched roofs, a mix of materials, and then it's got other details like exposed rafters and brackets and other elements like this. So this is a 4-story building. And that's an award-winning building of a craftsman style in 4 stories. So we think this is more than appropriate in this district to do more of those buildings if they're done within an urban grid setting. It makes more sense. So you get the handcrafted stonework, the shingles, the board and batten, and the 4/1 double hung windows. The next one is what we're calling arts and crafts. And so this is really, it's a mashup of a development style. So it may have some mission elements, it may have a lot of English elements like Tudor elements, an emphasis on roofs, and a lot of handcrafted wood elements and stucco. And that's a characteristic. So if you've ever been to Carmel in California, this is what they're all about. And Issaquah, in lots of ways, very much like Carmel. And so it has that small village characteristics to it. And so that's the idea within this area. So, and again, this isn't really the kind of use that you would expect for 6 or 8 story buildings, but it's really a 4 or less. And if we've got areas where we get bigger building, we need to come up with another typology. It's probably going to be something else. So what would that look like? And so this is a quarter that a project we did it's Lake Grove. It's in Lake Oswego, Oregon. So you get a commercial building that starts looking like this when you do arts and crafts. You get steep pitched roofs. You get this simplified English vernacular. You get these sorts of casement windows, more house style, as you can see, and a mix of materials. And then when you get more intensive development, this is A Avenue in Lake Oswego as well, you get some of these. So for example, we were talking about gateways. This is a gateway element, and you use it sparingly. It's a tower. So for example, we looked at some of the development proposals where they have just every quarter of the building, there's another tower. Towers need to be used sparingly. They really should be at really key points. And so this is the characteristics that you see here. So this is a mixed use, commercial, retail, and office above. Not real tall. And there's a parking structure, by the way, behind this. Again, house elements, pitched roofs, home type of elements like shakes and shingles, integrated fabric awnings, expansive storefront windows. Can be brick. But again, it's more house style, not real tall, and has those elements as well. So you can mix these. The point is, within these areas, it's not just one style, but it could be a mix of materials. Or here's another one. And this is office above, and you see this little porte cochere, and there's a tuck-under parking out back behind it. And so that has got shingles, and this is a mansard roof. It's not even a true roof. It's just a mansard. So it just slopes up, and it's flat behind it. And then you get apartment buildings where you get a little taller. So for example, if you want to get a taller building and really it's not appropriate to do a craftsman and you still want to keep some of those elements, this is 4 stories and this is a full block and this is over 100 units on this building. But you get the sense of that it's got that kind of character and compatibility with the style of your historic downtown, Old Town as well. So that's that. The next one would be, what happens if you do have a large redevelopment parcel? And this is a bit of a stretch, but your senior housing project that's in the Gateway area had a little bit of this element. But when you get to big buildings that are more than 4-story tall, you really are starting to talk about maybe more of a lodge. And think about what's the model that you get a building that's 100 feet long and 200 units and maybe has some shape to it. So this is really maybe some of the things you'd want to have as part of that, and it would be compatible. So if you're looking for more intense urban development, maybe there's some lodge elements as well that you could incorporate. So it's not limiting high-density buildings at 40 and 50 units an acre. You could still do this. And then finally, in particular for infill, your downtown has some wonderful fabric, and it really needs to be supported. So for example, if we're talking about this extension of Gilman, picking up the characteristic of front, you'd maybe want to really push some of these historic false Western storefront elements to it. So it's not mixing elements. These historic Northwest Western storefronts are all wood. That was the material people had in abundance around here. So they didn't mix stone and tile. It's all wood. And it's simple, fairly straightforward detailing. So you really want to keep and maintain that idea. And think about clear story windows, setting back doors, hanging signs, all these sort of elements. So that gives it some life and activity to it. And you can even get multifamily in here. This building, I probably would have painted it. I think it looked better if it's painted. But you can see this is a fairly large apartment building in that setting, and And it's pretty sympathetic. It picks up datum lines of, here's a line here, the base lines up, the middle lines up, and then there's got a top. So it's, it has some of the elements you're already talking about, your existing standards. So you can do density in a Western storefront vernacular as well. So that's kind of what was being suggested as very prescriptive standards or guidelines for this, the Issaquah style. So moving on to the urban core. So because you're going to get more density here, and it's more urban through your descriptions in the districts, it really requires a little bit of a different type of building. And so the idea here is to promote some innovation that is appropriate for dense urban conditions, but is timeless in character and respectful of the natural setting in the city as well. So the intent here is to take a look at what do we mean by accommodating all those requirements. And these guidelines, unlike the Issaquah style, are not going to be prescriptive, but rather they're going to be descriptive. So what we want to do is describe the form, the massing, the scale, the materials, and the color. So I want to go through these each at a time. So the form is the first one. So what we suggested would be a simplified composition with verticality emphasized and horizontal street walls segmented logically. So it doesn't become random and happenstance, but it has some meaning. So what we're suggesting is rather than these complex development forms that you're seeing on some of your development proposals that you're having today, that you simplify it a bit in form and massing. You see, this building is essentially 3 masses, not 5 different masses, but it's really a fairly simple composition. When you do get buildings that are longer, you can segment it logically in ways that look like actual buildings. So here's a building, here's a building, here's a building. And so that's how that is broken up. And so we're suggesting segmenting it that way through setbacks or through uses of different types of materials. So you establish what we'd call an urban rhythm. So it isn't schizophrenic, but there's sort of a musical sensitivity as what you're moving along a street edge. And then we want to think about, again, also how you would have some changes and really support the development in terms of base and middle and top. That's still a valid idea for some areas. So you see the building has a ground floor retail component to it. It has a commercial component, and a top. And then think about some other simplified forms. So not everything has to have a flat roof. You can do sloped roofs, but rather than traditional forms all the time, no doubt you could do that. You could do maybe a more simplified expression, such as in this building. And again, establishing that rhythm along the edges. So pushing for this a little bit more in contemporary interpretation, historic elements. Or it'd be something like this. Again, that's clearly a townhouse, and it's got very traditional materials, shingles and stucco, but it has more of a refined, expression on the frontage. Or something like this. So you get a little bit more of a different type of dormer. So the idea here is not to be so much looking in the past, but interpreting some of those historic elements more of in a contemporary manner without going over the top. Very, very minimal amounts of those sorts of things. So the next piece of this would be to talk about massing. And the idea here would do full block development, engaging the pedestrian realm. And the biggest piece of this is to minimize the parking impacts, either putting the parking internally in a building or screening it in all instances. Parking lots should not be allowed to be seen or viewed or even walked through in this district. So here's a couple of examples of what that would be. So this is a block, and this is a building bar, and it's 60 by 180. So it's 2 bars with a courtyard through the middle. Here's another form. It could be a C or a U with a courtyard internally. This is on a podium, so it's raised up, so it's private. That's one form as well, but the buildings are engaging the street. Or it could be an L, and such as this. So there's, in all instances, the buildings are always engaging the edge of the block. Or in some instances, it might be 2 uses. So for example, this is a residential development, and this is a grocery store. And then there is a small driveway with small amount of parking here, and parking is within this structure and down below. And so that parking is minimized, and it's essentially it's convenience parking. So that would be another form that we would try to institutionalize as well. And then we talk about the massing. So the idea here, we're getting some really movement on our slides, is that we want to have street-oriented ground floor units if you have residential. That needs to be a requirement. On every building that's residential, the ground floor needs to be accessed, not always, but really I should say promoted, that you have that occurrence. And so these are the kind of things that you want to have if you've got residential to ground floor. You need a bit of a transition. So it's okay to have the low privacy walls or terraces, raise it up a little bit, but you need a separation. So the front door isn't adjacent to the sidewalk. A little bit of separation is good here. If you do build up to the street, to the right-of-way, here's the right-of-way line, you need to have a grade transition. So the finished floor of this first unit is here, and so the units are here. So if I'm walking by, I can't look in windows. So there's, you can build up to the edge, but you need to do this sort of treatment where you separate it by grade. So where we do have mixed use, generally you want to make sure that you do build up to the street edge, and you do have a degree of transparency for all those ground floor uses. But there may be instances where you do have forecourts at entries or places where you want to have gatherings or outdoor seating. So you may want to do something like this, where you have a little carve out in the corner as well. Entries should be from the street as well, not parking. So it would be something like this, a lobby entry that we'd prescribe. Scale. So when we've got, really, when we talk about buildings that are 4 stories or more, we want to make sure that we have the step backs. So generally, if we had our druthers, all your buildings would be this tall. You know, really try to promote 4-story buildings throughout the district. This is a comfortable scale, I think, for Central Issaquah and preserve your views. So 4 to 5 stories would be what we'd look at. Something about that scale, that length, and that massing. If you get taller, again, talking about stepping, see that? As you get above a certain height level, that you need to step back, say, for example, 20 feet, such as this building, again, the public street, and the building steps back. And then talk about materials. Materials, what I'd like to see is a simplified palette of materials, so that every building doesn't have 4 or 5 material types, but maybe 2, most 3 for this district, and probably really pushing for 2 material types. So we suggest that you do a lot of brick. You're getting a lot of metal panels, you're getting a lot of hardy board, you're getting a lot of other materials. Say the fundamental majority of buildings in this district needs to be 60 or 70% brick on public frontages. Now you might have setbacks and use other materials, or for accent you might use wood. The bases might be concrete, but it's still brick, the major material. Metal cladding is probably okay, especially on interior areas or as connections. And we probably want to make some description of the type of metal paneling and the detailing of how that's done, because it's important so that that is long-lasting and it doesn't do what we call as oil canning. So if it's not done really well, it starts moving around and it looks like a bad RV over time. And and think about other materials like hardy board and where to put those. And also stucco as an accent material, not necessarily a primary material. So it was a way of just defining massing as well. And also some instances, especially along your greenways, really maybe even promoting wood. So if I've got a building that's facing the Issaquah Creek, maybe wood is okay as well. And then finally, the color. And the idea here is really to try to get away from the bright primary colors, but really to reduce your colors to light and dark colors. And really is to go to maybe, and maybe this is something you want to be more prescriptive of. So brick really works well if it's dark in our environment today. So it may be a dark brick. And it could be a light colored brick, a blonde brick, a white brick, cream colored brick. And then what we want to do is then have contrasting materials for your window frames. So generally keep those dark rather than light, so that we have more emphasis on the punching openings. And so avoid the lighter framing that you're seeing on some of the buildings. And there may be more of a natural color, like a wood color as well. You can see how the use of the colors are used here as well. And here's another application of dark brick, and this is a dark brown. So that's for the urban core area. And then we get into the final one is the Route 10 area. And that really, the idea here, we're jumping a little bit on this, and we haven't developed a lot of this, but maybe go to more industrial forms and maybe more barn forms that look more similar to your barn and Pickering, the Pickering district in the park up to the north. Maybe there's some more red and other colors that have that reference to it. So it's mostly a metal building and low building and an industrial character to it. So it would be something like these. You'd get these kind of buildings. And we'll get a little bit more detail on that. So I haven't spent a lot of time on that. So that's presentation. Really what we'll come back to you on the next steps is a draft document, and we'll get into more of the ways of dealing with that grid, the street hierarchy, some form-based standards where we suggest maybe you do require ground floor retail, and the characteristic of that floor. So we're going to have all of these sorts of elements, and we'll talk about them as well, where front doors go. So we're going to take those ideas and really reduce them into diagrams. So that's something that you can use as part of development proposals and get it back into your standards. So if you've got setbacks, how do you do that? Where's the 4-story maximum heights, if you want to do that, especially along greenways, and then some diagrams how you'd actually execute that. So these are fairly generic right now, so not necessarily what we'd propose, but you get the sense of what we're going towards. And then the characteristics of your greenways. So that's just a little kind of real quick preview of how we'll take this information and then translate it into something that's usable for you to review projects with. Okay, so I'm done and open for any more discussion, questions about that, and maybe a little direction. If we could come back and a little, maybe if somebody's okay or clearly doesn't want us to do something with any of these, I think now's the time to tell us so that we don't develop it any further. Okay, open for discussion.
Well, I really appreciate the notion of trying to be more prescriptive, if that's the right word, on style, and having areas, because I think you're correct that we were expecting everything everywhere and getting nothing anywhere. So the reality is having a sense and an even pictorial presentation of those three styles is really valuable. That really made a lot of clarity to me, and I think understanding the style is really going to be valuable and getting buy-off on that. But I really like that. That was really good.
Were there any of those styles you said are non-starter, we haven't considered something? Don't need to tell me now, but if you think about that, it's a good time to get that kind of stuff in here.
Well, I think the urban core on the surface looked a little stark to me. But at the same time, keeping in context of what that is, it made good sense. You know, at first I was saying, oh, wait, no, I don't think I want that, but it looked good to me.
So what we were trying to do is to try to create some consistency.
Yeah.
And not to be so prescriptive. But again, when you go into a city like Paris, for example, most of the buildings are light colored or dark. And so really it's trying to define the district. So you may say, well, you know, maybe in Hyla, since they've already done red brick buildings, maybe we should be prescribing red brick over there. So there's room for variation on this. But what we're seeing is that everything goes, everything under the sun, so that this block has no relationship to the next block. And so it's a dog's breakfast of every idea that's come out, you know, tilted roofs, peaks, caps, everything in, instead of really fighting this and trying to make it hand-to-hand combat on every project, to say, you know what, maybe the buildings, because it's simply just a residential building, it's not a civic building, and maybe it needs to be what we would describe as a background building. And so the overall composition of the district is more important than the individual building. And then really the value comes out in the detailing, in the construction quality, in the permanence and the timelessness of that. And then you have an emphasis on the greenery and the open space that really has prominence, and it's not competing with the architecture. So that was kind of the idea with that district, is really maybe try to turn down the notch a couple of levels, so it's a little bit less chaotic. Yeah.
Go ahead.
So I really appreciate that. I mean, for the year that I've been on here, I think I've struggled with trying to figure out what we're supposed to be doing as far as saying yay or nay to things. But we agreed to it because it matches all the legal pieces, but we're not quite sure how it fits into the bigger picture. And this would help have a big picture to play off of. That's kind of serendipity because I was coming out of Dick's Sporting Goods up there in the Highlands. And if you come out there, you have the new townhouses they built there, and they just finally got it all cleaned up. And it was just a straight shot through this little walkway between two different townhouse pieces. There's road on one side, road on the other side. In the middle is a walkway with trees, and it's like a little park for them. And it was just this clean, straight line. You could see everything kind of matched and felt good. It was really, I was like, hey, that is just serene to look at. So that was a kind of nice thing. The one architectural style that I was kind of so on was the English one, that I think it was arts and crafts. And the reason it's kind of felt too much like Leavenworth, and I think they have that kind of German mountain town feel to them. And I'm not, you know, we seem to be more of a Western mining kind of logging town than it is more than a mountain town.
Yep.
And I would agree with that same thing. That was the one that jumped out at me in the Issaquah Historical. The arts and crafts, to me, didn't seem to be the fit with the other things.
Yeah. The only issue I have on that is if you go with the craftsman style, it's really difficult to make it work for buildings that are larger than a garden apartment. So if you're going to get urban development that is, let's say you had full block development of a 400 by 250 foot block, and you wanted to do a 100-foot long building in a craftsman style, it's really, really tough to pull that off.
Wouldn't the Northwest Lodge work for that, as you're pointing out?
Yeah,
I think that fits us better because it kind of matches what we already have in a
Yeah.
couple different.
And we offered that to say, let's not box everybody in, and so that you're not going to have everything look the same. Because part of really the beauty of your old town is the eclectic nature of it. And so once you start getting everything the same, that's our fear. And we said, at this point, let's offer more than less. So if you want to take one off the table, we have no care for that.
I think, well, I don't mind the arts and crafts. I think it can offer a lot of richness, especially at that street level. But I think mostly what I wanted to say was I would like to add to the list.
Yeah.
And you started to touch on it at the end, but I'm stricken by our agricultural history and the structures of utility and mining. So I guess I wouldn't limit that notion of urban grange to these larger structures.
Yeah.
Can we get those on the parcel-based structures as well? I think especially if that light rail hub terminates in Pickering Place,
Yeah.
that's the vernacular over there. To what degree of success they've done it over there, I think is open to interpretation, but I like how it feels over there, and I think it's really going to activate that area. So
Yeah.
could we introduce this notion of agriculture?
Oh, yeah.
Or
And I
utility?
hadn't thought about that. I think it's a good idea.
Okay,
Yeah.
thanks.
I have a question for staff. So the next meeting that we have with you, will we be able to get, to see whether it's a PDF or a hard copy a couple of days before our next meeting, so that we can not have to be just reacting to the thing that night?
Yeah.
Sure. I mean,
I just,
right, we haven't seen any of this
oh, I
ahead
know,
of time
I
either,
know, Lucy, I just was
Right.
saying
Yeah,
for the next
we-
one.
We
this is-
we can provide that to staff, and they can
Yeah.
do what they want to do with it.
I liked everything I saw.
So-
But I would like, if that's
Yeah.
going to be the last meeting that we have, the DC has to put input a priori into this, I'd like a little more opportunity to just look at what
Yeah.
we're going to see that night.
Well, I think what we discussed with the team was that they really needed to hear your feedback.
Yeah.
And then go away and we'll likely work on more of an outline basis to try and identify sort of the structure and elements. And that would certainly be something that we'd all like to look at ahead of time so
Yeah.
that you're not shooting from the hip. And then probably bring back another round that's the actual draft code.
And would that, in the next thing that we're going to see, would that give us an idea of what you're proposing for the properties adjacent to the creek?
Yes, it would.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So we're gonna create this draft document, and I've doctored this up a little bit, because, and what we want to do is identify reviews of rounds of reviews. So what we want to do is come with towards the end of May, more or less an expanded outline. Not necessarily all the detail, but give you a sense of the structure and the form, and say, here's generally what the document's going to look like. And not necessarily have it all written out or have all the final pieces of it, and get a buy-off on that. And then through the next, maybe every 3 weeks or so, add more so that we can get your reaction to it and through written. And we can deliver this to Keith. You can edit it, combine it into one document, and then we can get back and forth on it. So my sense is, rather than us finishing a draft and delivering it to you and saying, now you missed it by a large margin and come back and rewrite it, if we get your constant involvement as we develop it, it'd be better.
We agree.
Did you folks get a chance to see the surveys that the city does? I don't know if, this may have been brought up in our first meeting with you, but have you seen the surveys that the city government sends out to determine what the priorities are and what the treasures are?
I may not have seen specifically what you've seen, but I've seen some of that information.
Okay. Is
So,
that,
Randy,
yeah.
just to make sure that we know, so they have seen the Issaquah treasures.
okay.
They've gotten that list. In terms of, I'm not sure we've sent them any surveys, so I just want to make sure I understand. Are you thinking of the one that's happening in Old Town? Or are you thinking of the citywide citizen survey?
Well, both actually, but I seem to recall getting 2 or 3 surveys from the city, and my understanding, it used to be at least every other year, sometime back. But the point is, as I recall it, it's very consistent over a long period of time about what the citizens identify as the priorities for the town. And I would think that for something like this, it would be an important element to at least be aware of, because it does go back. And I don't know if they're even available anymore, but I remember when I moved here, I got one, I was sent one, and I was tremendously impressed by the effort And again, my understanding is it's very consistent for the,
Yeah.
however many have been done.
There's-
It's
there's a-
always the same
Sorry,
5 or
I
6
interrupted
things.
you. There's a citizen survey going on right now, and I
Front
think,
Street.
no, citywide, I think.
Oh, okay, good.
And I think that is the results, I saw it on the council agenda for June or something, I think, that
Yeah,
the results.
and there was
are
also
supposed-
one for the Front Street redesign that involved public, public meetings, and here's what we heard, and then they went back out for, and it's very inclusive.
Right,
That's in progress right now.
right, the Old Town one, I think we are trying to make sure that the different districts have different characters.
Yep.
So I think the question is how to use that information so we're not,
Yeah.
But I do think I think some of the things that came out of the Old Town meetings and so forth, and the preferences that we saw, even though it doesn't have to define all the other districts, could be very helpful in terms of what citizens see for Old Town and might see in general for the city as well, to give you some ideas between, because there were things about, we prefer this, not this kind of thing too, so. I think that info would be helpful.
Yep.
I have to also throw in, I did like the light and dark idea, especially after dealing with Atlas Blue.
Now you tell us.
But in general, I hadn't thought of that before, but keeping those light and dark tones, I think, in those larger buildings could make a big difference.
Yeah, keep it simple sometimes, the background buildings, it doesn't have to be, the focus of, their lifetime achievement project every time that they develop one of these. It doesn't have to be different, it's not a showroom for materials.
It seems to me, the interesting things can be at the ground level, where
Yeah.
it's the pedestrian level
Yeah.
and so forth. I did find out, I think, agreed with the chair somewhat, that a few of the buildings that we saw for the urban area seemed a bit stark to me. One of the things I didn't see a lot of were balconies, and I don't know if
Yeah.
if that's something that can be worked into the
Well,
larger
sure.
buildings, or if
We can
it's.
talk about balconies, but the reason I avoided some of those things, because they tend to get in the way of the concept that I'm talking about, because people say, oh, I'm looking at the balconies. I wanted to talk about the form and the massing. And so that's part of the reason I showed you some of the stuff that's a little bit stripped down, because, I didn't want you to get distracted by that. But
Yeah.
clearly, if you want to see a more definition of buildings and use of materials, we can do that as well. That we, have no problem adding some of that. And we've got
Lots of
any number
pictures.
of images that we can show you as well.
Well, I really appreciated the distinctiveness of the 3 areas that you were defining, and that really helped me a lot. And so I can live with some pretty stark looking stuff in one, like in the industrial area. When you look at the Issaquah and the urban, I can deal with some urban core stuff that's pretty stark. When you add on the architectural details that we're probably going to see in Issaquah style and industrial, I really like that. I thought that was really important. And it clearly defines space. I think a lot of the comments that we've gotten from the public is that we aren't building anything that is distinctive, that really defines Issaquah. And I think both the Issaquah style and the industrial could do that really well.
Yeah.
The industrial, it looked like we had what I think we call the historical district. The Gilman, the east part of Gilman was included in the industrial
Right.
type
The-
code, and
the old-
I wondered if that's a conflict. I can see on the north side of I-90 industrial there, but,
We had the industrial characteristics in the Route 10 district.
Route 10, yeah.
And that,
East of Front Street, right?
yeah, east
Yeah.
of front.
Where
In that area, I kind of
Where the
was wondering.
triple
if-
X's.
Triple
and-
X.
And green.
That's where I wondered, I was thinking, I was thinking more historical highway type stuff, and can that fit with where your ideas of industrial, so.
Well, what I was looking at and thinking about was really kind of the land use stuff that they were looking at and what we've seen people do. So for example, if it was a destination restaurant hub, for example, under one roof, you got 5 or 6 restaurants with a food court. We see that a lot. Or it's a combination of wine tasting and culinary school. Those are the kind of things I think would be really viable there. a roadhouse, Route 66 sort of idea. I'm not quite sure what that is, and I'm not sure how authentic that is to this area. So I need more help on that, I guess is what we've struggled to really get a definition of what that is. And so anything that you can provide us and help us out with that. Like you talked about, this agricultural stuff was a really good idea. You know, I think some of those ideas were good.
Yeah, there's a little agricultural store over there. You know, there's
Range, yeah.
the Grange, you know, and
Yeah.
there's agricultural throughout this region,
Yeah.
and people come here
Yep.
for this and that. So I think it's an important component to address, and so maybe it does reach up that way. But then there's also Bohm's up there, you know, and do we tip our hat to that at all? You know, and maybe that's covered in the craftsman / arts and crafts. It's sort of in there somewhere, but I don't know. It is a tough little pocket over
Yeah.
there.
So my tendency is to try to just morph those areas together with the Issaquah style and say about anything goes over in that area. And maybe through just descriptions, we say you emphasize this in the old Route 10 as an agricultural vernacular.
Because I think you
But
could
offer it.
Because
others.
in that agriculture, you can almost blend together that cultural and industrial at the same time, that,
Exactly.
you know,
Yeah.
have the restaurants in the barn
Yeah.
type of thing.
We're really reticent to do a lot of, you know, historic recall. Is really got to have, I mean, to be prescriptive about it, you really don't want to import it, but you've got to, you know, Front Street in the Old Town is pretty strong. And I think you've got a really strong rationale to say, you're going to do these styles. And I think in that area, as opposed once you get over to, you know, beyond that and into the core, there really isn't, you know, any rationale, because it would be imported and it would be false historicism because there's not a context for it. That's how we did the division. It's tough to pull off, by the way, too.
It is tough.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's tough. I have a question just on a practical implementation. What comes first? Do you set up the gateways and then there's infrastructure that's put into place, and then how do you handle and grapple with something like the Home Depot, that block, the super blocks over there that are so massive, and start to break them down? Like,
Well,
how
the
do you
question
do it?
is, you know, there really wasn't any sort of instruction in the Central Issaquah plan that says that we want to, it wasn't clear to me, that it says we want to see permanence of the big box buildings today. Because you see a lot of applique on them today. You know, you go along freeways and you see a Walmart with the, you know, these add-ons to the entries, a peak roof and a little bit of wood on it, and, you know, a little bit of stone around the entry. But essentially, it's still a big box. And we can make those suggestions if that's what you want to have to soften these buildings in the meantime. There's not any problem in doing that. And the question is, does it further just keeps them there longer, and maybe you really don't want them there? I don't know. It's just one of those things. And on top of that, there's this whole sort of corporate identity you have to work into and to play. You know, Lowe's likes blue, you know. They're going to want to have a lot of blue stuff. You know, Home Depot wants their orange. And so it's, you can tell them no, but is it worth following your sword for? And if you want us to do that, we can do it.
Okay.
I'm sorry. go ahead.
Nope.
Yeah.
But so the idea is that this is going to be guidance for a long time. If we can, once this gets
Yeah.
in place, this is going to help a long-term planning and ultimate maintenance of the identity of the city. So when it comes to that section with the Fred Meyer and the Home Depot, with the way things are going, who knows what big box retail is going to be 10 years from now, 5 years from now,
Yeah.
15. So my understanding is that what we're looking at here is not necessarily altering what's there now, but getting in place what we want it to look like if and when there are market-driven changes
Right.
to the present use.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
You've got it.
In a sense, does it force that?
Yes.
Forces
hard
that
you wanna do it.
conversation.
And can I just throw one thing in? Because talking about Fred Meyer and Home Depot makes me think of this. The way the code is written right now is if they're doing something to it, they have to bring it into compliance to the greatest extent feasible. So I think the question is, you know, as this evolves, what is the expectation for those buildings that stay as they do various, you know, add-ons and changes? Are we trying to do those incremental improvements that Don was suggesting, or do we just leave them alone during that time? I mean, and I'm not proposing anything. I'm just saying that's something that we need to consider as we have these things that might be around for 10, 20, 30 years before they redevelop.
Some kind of a proportional compliance requirement. They
Yeah.
make a certain amount of investment or reinvestment. It triggers a certain level of upgrade as they're
So,
doing it.
and it's not a problem for us to say, if you're going to have an improvement to a big box and it's in the old Issaquah district, how do you apply some of these eclectic elements to that? We can do that. I mean, there's no problem with doing that. It's just a question of, I think you probably want to do it on the light side, and maybe there's a lot of images, and not be all, as I say, use these kind of elements, okay? And it's more suggestions.
So I have just a couple of, kind of step back just a little bit, because you put a lot of information up on the screen tonight, and I'm trying to process kind of what's in the scope and what's out, because essentially you were talking about redefining street grids, changing building heights, redefining the character of the different areas within the Central Issaquah plan, and that's a lot of big moves that you put up there. And I'm just, I guess my practical hat on here is what's realistic here to try to advance within this moratorium period, and then what's the strategy after that to continue to evolve the plan and make it work more effectively and deliver on the concerns that the community has been expressing. So I guess that's my first kind of big question about, you know, kind of what's realistically within the scope of the change that we're contemplating here.
So what we talked about was, when we talked about what you had today is you have a lot of policy, and then you have standards and guidelines, but you didn't really have a framework to base those on. I remember it shows you that. You skipped a step. What we did is we need to fill the step in. And so what we're saying is, this is just, we're going to give that to you just for your consideration. But we needed to go out here to come back, because now we can say, you saw what we meant by a grid, now we're going to give you a block standard. And it's based on something that we've tested rather than in the ether, we just pulled it out of our hat. And so you can see how we applied it. So we're going to strip a lot of that away. We can give it to you for advisory information, but it's not going to be that much stuff. We're going to just focus on
Because that kind of stuff
the last
scares
piece.
people that
Yeah.
own the property where those lines are going
Yeah.
through, and so it creates a different conversation out in the community
Yeah,
when you
and
start
you
talking
haven't
about
had a public discussion about that stuff, you haven't had any of that. But it gives you a framework for how we're going to get to some really staccato, concise elements that talk about a grid, form, massing, scale, and all those other things that come along with it, and a rationale for where you're going to require ground floor retail.
So that helps. So some kind of specific feedback on some of the things that you talked about. At the beginning, you talked about kind of the kind of Issaquah Creek and kind of the natural environment that we're trying to take advantage of, and you've got buildings now that turn their back on those. And the idea of taking advantage of those and integrating those into the kind of the designs and the construction of the buildings that happen where you're actually facing out and having dining areas or restaurants or even residential uses that open out onto those spaces. So instead of the back of the building feeling, it's actually a part of that. I really like that idea, and I think that's a smart thing to really take advantage of the assets. And that's part of the experience we want people to have, whether they're living here, working here, or visiting a restaurant. So I think that was, I like that suggestion or idea. The idea about the grid system, the one piece about the separated pedestrian through block connections that I think is kind of what we have, in lining that up, and so you have these longer corridors that people can get off the grid of traffic and have a more kind of pedestrian friendly less intense experience, I think is a good idea. And I know we've talked about the green necklace and trying to, do some of that. But I think figuring out a way to more specifically, particularly in the central core area, build in those kind of green open spaces and how you connect those together to create that experience like you talked about, where within 3 blocks you need to have some public amenity for people. And that concept, I think, really is attractive to me too. I think that makes a lot of sense. I like the idea of defining where the kind of the employers are, where you want to try to concentrate the retail, and then the residential. Because what you do with development and the framing of the development in those areas is going to be different to attract that kind of use, and then to allow those uses to be successful uses too. So if you try to smoosh them all together all the time, then you lose that separation and character. So I like that idea. And then you plant those seeds and they start to grow, and then they can become something even more later once they get a foothold, I think. This idea of these retail nodes that you defined. So I thought that was good. And then back to the stuff that we deal with a lot, the idea of, defining these kind of architectural styles and showing some images that reflect the architectural styles, I think is really useful, I think, for us. The idea of clarity around building form and what we need, and it showed some good images. And I like even from the concept, you're saying, in the urban center, we're looking for these much simpler sorts of building forms, but that doesn't mean that's ultimately the character you get there. If you do a bunch of big blocks, that's boring. But you do some things that are more interesting, but you have a style, image and style that you're trying to get to. So that was really, I think, interesting. And the other part that's particularly a concern is and been frustrating is the definition of what materials go where. We got the major list of stuff, metal siding, wood siding, lap siding, EFIS, you throw it on the table and it goes. So the idea of really durable materials, particularly in the urban area, like using brick as a primary or stone, it gives a sense of longevity. And you really do get longevity out of those buildings when you're applying those sorts of materials. And so I thought that being more specific about materials, what materials and where they're allowed, I think will really help the character definition that you talked about too. So those were kind of my thoughts as you were throwing all those things up there. And I think there's some really good ideas that will be really helpful.
Yeah, so we'll be really prescriptive about those sorts of things, and we'll talk about it. And so, for example, if we want to have stone at the base, we're going to say, for example, it cannot be a half-inch veneer. We want a depth to it. And then we'll show you an example that says this is appropriate, this isn't. Because sometimes you need to see what's inappropriate, because it's really clear what you don't want to have as well. So we'll give you what's appropriate and what is inappropriate. So we'll talk about that as well.
So picking up on that same idea for colors, would you consider specifying a color palette of primary and secondary colors in any parts of this, or is that too constraining in your judgment?
I don't know yet. I think that's open for discussion. I think my tendency is to say yes, and to really try to limit colors. So for example, if you can do metal roofs, you don't want red or blue or orange. You want a darker color, maybe silver, maybe, so that they're not dominant. So it doesn't look like an IHOP, these sorts of old.
More of an accent.
Yeah. But in certain areas, if it's an agricultural characteristic, maybe red's okay, as a barn. I don't know. We'll think about that. But I think we need to think about it a little bit. But I think one of the better objectives is to think about how buildings are in an urban environment. You have more background buildings than special buildings. And you reserve the special architecture and the special differences to public libraries or city hall or a hospital. Housing doesn't necessarily need to be the most important building every time it's built. It needs to be part of a fabric. And that's what successful neighborhoods are. It's more about the accumulation of the neighborhood rather than a specific building. And being contextual and respectful of what's your environment and your neighbor. And we want to push a little bit on that.
You know, talking about the buildings in the urban design area and some of the forms that we saw,
Yeah.
one of the things I think that, in thinking about it, that seemed to miss to me on some of them was the lack of sloped elements. You know, you did show some sloped roof lines. A lot of them were more box-like, and I think part of the thing in Issaquah, it's the Alps around us and the slopes
Yeah.
that define our city in large ways. So I wonder if some ways it can be incorporated in terms of, say, window coverings, or not even, doesn't necessarily have to be a sloped roof, but sloped elements in the building design somewhere that can tie into those, the Issaquah Alps.
I
If
think
that's
we can do
possible.
that. The reason why is typically when you get a bigger building, you get, especially like an apartment building, there's a need for lots of mechanical equipment and other things. And typically those go on the roof.
Right.
And so that's the value of having a flat roof. Now, that doesn't mean you have to do that. I mean, you can do slopes, you can do mansards, you can do penthouses, you can do all sorts of things.
And
So
even-
in our sense is, yeah, you do want to have a slope. And then also it's just the width of the building too. So if you've got a 60-foot wide building, that's a lot of roof.
Yeah, well, not, like I said, not necessarily on the roof per se, but even if people are providing some window coverings that are small sloped window coverings that can break up a vertical mass in a way
Yeah,
to,
sure.
just
Uh-huh.
to sort of recall the
Yeah.
slope of the hills, so.
Yeah, and I agree with you on that, but again, you know, you start a slippery slope. When you start getting into this, and all of a sudden you got this applique, and then you got some of the buildings that you got today, where they said, you know, stop me before I design again, because I got everything in the sun under it. You know, it's just, I guess our point is, in certain areas, you want to show a little bit of restraint. And you say, yeah, you can do that, but you got to make it, you got to convince me why it's a rationale to do it. And we'll give you some ways to do that, but I think you're right. We need to give you a little bit more, to give you a little bit more variety in the building. Okay.
My reaction is that I just have to restrain my enthusiasm, because
You're doing a good job.
I don't want to be overly excited about this. I just think this is exactly what we have been asking for and more, and I'm very, very enthusiastic about this. And I didn't see a single thing that was in terms of a style or a concept or whatever that I saw as there was nothing negative about it. I really appreciate the definition of the districts and the matching of the architectural styles and the concepts of linking them together. The one thing though that I just think has to be very clear is how the different forms of traffic are going to connect, and that we do no harm. We don't. That the ultimate aspect of this is that there is at least a maintenance of existing movement, speed, and efficiency through the districts, and that's obviously, that's what everybody wants, but getting it is going to be a challenge with the growth we've got ahead, and particularly with the ST3 stations coming in. But as far as the rest of it is concerned, I'm tremendously impressed by it.
So I think you're right, and I think you got to maintain the regional facilities, but the grid helps you. Getting people to change mode, to take transit, to take bike trips and walking, because probably right now you probably got 99% of the people are driving. You want to get that down to 75 or 60. So as you absorb growth, your traffic volumes aren't growing that are locally generated. It's tougher to control the regional trips. That's why I'm saying you need a concept that says we're going to reclaim our core and say where the regional trips are important, we need to maintain those, but maybe we don't have they're on the outsides and not on the inside. And so we're pushing the scope here, because we're talking about a much more traffic analysis and much more public discourse about these roadways. But as a concept, we want to maybe distill what we showed you down to maybe a much more of a diagram. Because part of Yeah, I've talked to it enough about the rationale for this.
Can I ask one last
Yeah.
question just about, let's fast forward 30, 40 years down the road. Communities like this that employ these tools become very self-selecting communities. You talked about Carmel. I would cite Palo Alto, Boulder, Colorado.
Yeah.
These types of places tend to become very self-selecting. And in order to inhabit these places, you have to hire a guy like me to help you navigate how to get anything done. So I think, in essence, it forces mixed income or lower income people out of the city. And so I think the question is, how do you address mixed income, low income for the long term? Does my question make sense?
Yeah, it does. I
It
think
just becomes
yeah.
this boutique, precious place. And
Well-
that's the only pitfall I see in creating something
Yeah.
this special.
It's out of scope for us, but I think it's an issue that really needs to be addressed. And because we've been doing this, I've done affordable housing studies for housing authorities around the country. And we know this is not a unique situation. And it's a policy decision and it's a funding decision. And it's also then figuring out where you're going to pick up the land and build it. Bottom line is, inclusionary zoning and other things like that is a good thing to do. But in the end, if you want to have a range of incomes in a city that's seen an elevated cost, you're going to have to build it. And you may not ever catch up, but at least you're doing some. So.
Okay.
I don't know what else I can say. The other advantage is that you do give people to not spend all their money on commuting and cars and driving if they can walk, bike, and take transit.
Sure.
So instead of spending $5,000, $6,000 a year on a car, I maybe throw that into rent, and maybe I can afford a place like this.
Sure.
So it's not an answer,
Yeah,
but it's a
and I know
strategy.
it's not necessarily
Yeah.
a responsibility, and I know it is largely a policy discussion, but I have seen, it has that potential.
Yeah.
that-
It's just the nature of planning. You can either be reactive or proactive, and you're choosing to be proactive. I mean, and those are the places that last. You could say, yeah, we're going to be very affordable, but it's kind of, it's because nobody really wants to be there.
Exactly.
I mean, it's a tough decision.
Yep. All right, thank you.
I think it's obvious that we're pretty excited about what we've seen. I guess the thought that keeps puzzling through my mind is what are the steps or what is the mechanism to make sure people understand what appears to be a pretty good change? Where do we go from here? And I know we'll have a draft, but is there a plan to have public meetings to talk about this or to show that? I don't know. And the reason I'm asking is I think there would be a lot of people that come to these meetings regularly that would be really excited about what they're hearing.
So, so these are open to the public, and
Oh, we appreciate their attendance.
and I know that at least a few people are watching because I'm getting texts. So what I would say is, from here, and I do want to answer Mike's question because I thought it was a good one. It was kind of spooling around in my head, the one related to scope. I mean, I think what we heard tonight about architecture was probably clearly within everybody's expectation that that's one of the things that we were going to be doing. But as you kind of then pivot to urban design, that's where you potentially can fall off the edge of the planet, right? I mean, what do you put in that box and what do you put out? Some of the things that I heard, and I'm having this so that they can maybe start to focus on what they thought was, the things the pieces that are key to moving forward with this particular project. The orientation to the King County Trail and to the creek was definitely one urban design element that was kind of primary to this. I heard ground floor units having direct access out onto the street as being key. There's probably a few other nuggets that are worth kind of spooling around on and talking about priority. As it relates to some of these other pieces, those are important. I mean, I think as we start to then, how they then go from potentially a concept like, so the street grid that they've shown on a map tonight is not consistent with what's in the plan. And so the question is what do you do with that inconsistency at this point? And are we making any recommendations on revisiting the transportation portion of Central Issaquah plan or not coming out of this? We certainly can. I think part of what we need to assemble over the following conversations that we're going to have about this is what of these pieces do you guys want to latch on to and try to affect changes on? I think, as we started to talk about urban design, things like balconies and direct access to the streets were kind of the low bar that we wanted to make sure we hit. But then how far above that we go, I think we can somewhat figure that out as we move forward with this. And part of it may be based on some of the next iterations. And I wanted to at least key in one of the things that I think they said was, this is not you getting a 100% draft document next and saying, okay, just go ahead and put this on a shelf somewhere. I mean, I guess I would equate it more to getting like a 10% set of drawings and a 30% set of drawings and a 60% and a 90% so that it evolves along the way by the time the final draft comes in, everybody's feeling comfortable with scope and kind of what we chose to bring forward and whatnot. Now, it could ultimately be that we have this design manual, but then maybe there's a set of ancillary recommendations that this commission might want to make to the city council for 2018 work items, 2019 work items, 2020 work items, yeah. So that's, I guess I would leave that one as kind of an open door, Mike. I think it was a great question to ask. I think it was kind of spooling around in my head too. But that, I think I needed to say that. So Richard, I think in terms of public process, so where we go from here, there's another conversation with the council, once we get kind of things moving forward a little bit further. And then ultimately, we're talking about code revisions, so that goes to Planning Policy Commission. And so there's other opportunities there. The good thing about moving 6 balls forward at the same time is these conversations should then affect the conversations about district visions, neighborhood visions, as we start to potentially, as you guys start to resonate on, let's differentiate the 1,100 acres of Central Issaquah into maybe 3 distinct architectural zones to start to create some distinction within that overall area. Well, okay, how does that now jive with the districts and the districts? And, because what we're hearing out of the districts is, people want to have some distinction within those neighborhoods to, have a sense of place, have a character that may differentiate maybe a neighborhood south of I-90 from one north of I-90. Well, architecture has a lot to do with that. And so we need to start to kind of weave some of these pieces together along with parking and affordable housing. Because I don't think we want to be Vail. You didn't pick Vail, you picked Boulder. And I'll go with Vail, although Boulder's similar. So I think all of these things start to fit together. It's a lot. There's a lot of stuff moving this year related to the moratorium. It's all really good. The reason why we're doing these things on TV is so that there is a video record as well. I know I've told a lot of people to watch their presentations. There's a lot of things that they say. Whoever said, I think maybe it was Randy, there's a lot of information tonight. There was a lot of information tonight. I mean, it might take a day to kind of unpack some of it and start to, get some sense of, what it all meant to us. So all I'm saying is we're kind of figuring this out as we go. If you guys feel like needs to be some other public opportunities, let's talk about that, because I don't think we're opposed to that, but I don't know that we know what that looks like just yet. There's other public conversations. I don't know if it's next week, I think, is some vision. There's vision conversations happening.
One on May 10th and one on May 26th?
One's at Atlas. So there's one being held at Atlas and one being held, somewhere else, my apologies. I'm sure it's on the moratorium page I showed you guys earlier. So part of it will be, as we talk to the community about the neighborhood visions, we'll be talking about what we're hearing in the architectural piece as well. I mean, it all needs to fit together.
Ryan, you had your hand up.
Oh, yeah, I was just going to make a point about, you brought up connecting north and south I-90, and just if you had a proposed solution for that. I know there is, you have Front Street 900, and then there is like a little under way, but it's kind of designed kind of strange. And then getting to the Costco side, you have to drive all the way north, all the way to cross over. So if there's something to solve that problem.
And we kind of brushed over that, and we'll give you that, because I think there's really at least 2 crossings that you need to make. One would be related to light rail, and the other would be another roadway. And that's all in your central Issaquah, some of the roadway stuff, but we've thought about that a lot. Okay, we'll do that.
So procedure-wise, our next look would be maybe May 25th, but that would be our last look as a,
So I think we have to revisit the schedule
oh, okay.
based on, because if we're going to do 2 touches, an outline and
So
more
it may be,
refined,
so part of it is, we need to talk to them now about next steps. It may very well be that we get like a draft, and then staff goes through that with you guys, has a forum of conversation, and then we then Skype a conversation with them, so they don't have to come up so many times. I can only afford to transport them up so much.
Yeah, because I think towards the end, it'll be very helpful, the mechanics of our decision-making process, your applies, complies, check boxes,
Yeah.
and those kind of things. And
Because
those
the
will-
end is, we've got to give you a product that you can use on a project-by-project basis to review a project.
Yeah.
And that's our sole focus is to provide you that tool to do it, and to provide as much, as we said in the first, predictability as possible for you and the developer, so that you know the games of the rules. And so we'll get there. It's just one last thing I would say, though. I would really push on a grid, because it really defines everything from the architecture to the access points. And there's lots of ways we can deal with a grid, but you have none today. And it's really, the difference between urban places and suburban places is the grid. And if you got one thing out of this process and nothing else, it would be the grid. And I really want to push that right now, and so I don't want that to slip away, and to say, oh, we can't do that because maybe a zone change, we haven't had enough discussion about that. I would urge to have the discussion, because the grid is a big deal.
My big deal, my one hope, ultimate hope, is that this process will allow me personally, when it comes to decision time, to have far fewer reluctant positive decisions.
Yeah.
And has been the case up to now.
Yeah, because you want to be able to say, when you reviewed a project, it says, this is what it said in the guide. You either complied or you didn't. That's why I'm not voting for you, or I'm going to prove it because it's consistent with what's in the guide.
So just on the emphasis you just made on the grid, out of all of the concepts that you put up, that's the biggest lift by far in change that you're suggesting. When you think about the current street network that exists and the super block condition, or super blocks in some cases, they're huge, and how you create those kind of through connections for vehicles and pedestrians, et cetera. It has to happen somehow, but I think that's a big policy conversation that maybe staff and you, and maybe, in some contact with the council, need to think about how far we want to take that conversation now.
Yeah.
Because that's a pretty big community conversation.
I'll tell you this, if you can't define a grid, you're going to struggle to talk about active edges, pedestrian ways, and how buildings relate to the public realm, unless you've got a grid. We can distill it down and make it generic, so it's not specific to a specific site, and give it enough flexibility so that it can change depending on things. But you need to have a framework which these buildings sit in which these open spaces relate to,
Yeah.
And, because without that, you've got what you got today.
Right. I
Hand in
agree.
hand. Yeah.
I totally understand the
Yeah.
concept, and I agree that you need that. That's the
Mhm.
urban environment. I
Yep.
mean, that's what you'll find in the successful cities is the smaller blocks. If they have big blocks, they've got through connections and they allow pedestrians to move through, so you don't have those long hikes you've got to make to get from one place to another. It's just a strategy that needs to
Yep.
be, I think, thought
Yep.
through. How do we get from where we are now to start rolling that conversation out, and then eventually figure out how to make it happen and how to fund it and
Yeah.
et cetera.
I also believe without it, we don't have as much ability to have street level commercial on those buildings, because then you kind of cut off two edges that you could have had, plus the pedestrian walkways. You can move traffic through there by having more pedestrian, more bicycle pathways that are outside of the road traffic. So it would make a huge difference in the way people would interact with the environment.
Okay.
Any other comments, commissioners? Well, we really appreciate it. We're excited. We're encouraged. Really feels like you're going the right way, and so we're looking forward to what the next meetings are going to reveal. So I guess with no other comments, I'll adjourn the meeting.
Right, thank you.
Thank you.
Keith, do you want to save this somewhere?